As Wendy's already said, my name is Mike Docherty, and I work for the Scottish Social Services Council. My responsibilities there are, as it's usually termed, workforce intelligence, lead officer for workforce intelligence for the sector. And part of that work also involves the sector skills agreement. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with that, but I'll say a little bit about the sector skills agreement work that we're involved in as part of Skills for Care and Development, which is the Sector Skills Council for the social services sector. Something else you may not know too much about, but I'll touch on as we go through this presentation. I'll try and make connections. There's a number of things that Derek was saying, which I think we can probably all connect with, and I'll certainly make one or two connections as I go through the process just now. Okay. Background. Why are we involved in this? I suppose is one issue for us as the SSSC, and why should this be something of concern to all of us? I think workforce planning, as Derek has already said, is something which has grown in importance, or seems to have grown in importance in the last 5 years or so. If you look at, even if you do a search in Google, looking for workforce planning, workforce development, phrases like workforce intelligence, workforce analysis, workforce information, and so on. These phrases, certainly phrases I come across increasingly in the last few years. Partly, I suppose, because of the job, and that's my area of interest, but they're not phrases I was particularly familiar with, say, 4 or 5 years ago, and there does seem to be a new interest in looking at our workforce, that human resource, and how they're deployed and how they're developed as individuals. And for me, workforce planning, I suppose there are definitely two sides to it. There's both the bit that people often talk about in terms of workforce development, which is about the development of individual skills, helping people develop to achieve particular qualifications. I think the other side of that for me is also, what might be called organisational development. It's about how you use that resource, it's the deploying of that resource. There are probably, I don't think I could give a definitive answer as to why this has become a particular area that we hear more about, a new area of interest. I think certainly some of the things that Derek touched on in the first presentation, which apply to the health sector, also apply to our sector. For one thing, our sector has seen huge growth. So the numbers of people working within social services in Scotland has seen huge growth in the last 10, 15 years. Some of you are, as I mentioned earlier, one of my responsibilities as part of the role I'm in the council is in relation to developing something called a Sector Skills Agreement. And that is something, it's an exercise, if you like, that is taking place across all sectors of the Scottish economy, all sectors of the UK economy. In fact, the government has licensed 25 bodies called Sector Skills Councils, who have responsibility for looking at the skills needs, amongst other issues, of the sector that they have responsibility for. There's a Sector Skills Council in the health sector, in the justice sector, oil and gas industry, retail, etc. And there's also one for the social services sector. And the Scottish Social Services Council is one of the 5 organisations across the UK that makes up a body called Skills for Care and Development, which is the body responsible for looking at skills needs within the social services sector. As part of that process, one of the things that we're aware of is, are very aware of, is the substantial growth that we've seen in the sector. As I said, 42% increase in the workforce between 1995 and 2004 in Scotland. It's a huge growth. I mean, one of the biggest, probably the only other sectors which probably saw anything similar in terms of growth in Scotland were health and financial services. That in itself, if you've got that number of people coming into the sector, I think as a result of initiatives like community care starting in the early 90s, like supporting people, like the childcare strategy, to name but 3, if you've got sector growing like that, then you're obviously going to be seeing people coming into the sector who are going to require training of some kind. It's unlikely that everyone who comes into the sector will immediately have all that they require to do the kind of jobs that we require them to do. So there's issues around the growth of the sector, I suggest. There are issues around employment levels in Scotland. In terms of the participation, the numbers of people actually in work in Scotland are probably the highest in Europe, or about the highest in Europe. 75 to 80% of people of working age in Scotland are in employment. And in particular parts of the country, obviously the proportions are higher. Competition with other sectors, other employers for jobs increases as a result of that. We also see, as has been touched on, changes in demography, which are slowly taking an effect on the Scottish population, and they have been taking an effect on the population for some years, in fact. It's not a relatively new phenomenon. But we're aware of increasing ageing population in Scotland, increasing numbers of people over the age of 65, 75, 85, and we expect to see corresponding increase in demands for services. And we also, although one of the difficulties of predicting this, I suppose, is because of what will happen in terms of migration, inward migration into Scotland. But the projections have been, up until relatively recently, that we will see a gradual shrinking of the numbers of people who are of working age in Scotland. So there's this kind of reducing resource, if you like. These issues, or issues like these, I think I would suggest are probably some of the reasons why workforce planning, workforce intelligence, this area has become of increasing concern. We want to make sure that we're making the best use of what is becoming an increasingly scarce resource, I would suggest, or will be in the future years. There are other issues around about productivity and efficiency, certainly within the government's agenda, which also, I think, concern us, or should concern us, around issues of how we deploy the workforce, how we deploy it, whether that's at a national level. And I think, one of the things that's probably worth bearing in mind is, in terms of differences, well, I think there are many similarities between ourselves and the NHS. The NHS, relative to ourselves, is more of I'm just thinking exactly how to describe it, but probably we can tend to think of it as more of one organisation, albeit many boards, many trusts, and obviously looking to work in partnership with other sectors, but more of one organisation than we perhaps are in our own sector. We're aware, for example, that although we don't have the very good data on this at the moment, but we think there are something like 3,000 separate employers working within the social services sector in Scotland. Now, if you take it, if we say the workforce population in Scotland is something like 140,000, that's roughly, you can debate exactly the definitions of the sector and so on, but roughly 140,000. If you've got 3,000 employers, then that means on average you've got about 35 employees working within for each of those employers. We know that local authorities, 32 local authorities, employ probably about 65,000 people within the workforce. So you take them away from 140,000. We know that there's maybe about, what's that? My maths is not moving up here from is that 75,000? Yeah, 75,000, thank you. 75,000 people across roughly 3,000 employers, minus 32 local authorities. So we know that probably on average, the employers in our sector are employing only 30 people, albeit that there are some parts of the sector with very large employers, whether that's local authorities or large hauliers or large, for example, Bernardo's, Crossreach, or perhaps large private organisations like Four Seasons and Adult Residential Care, or name of one of the early years providers, Escaping Bright Horizons in early years. So there's a wide variety of providers within our sector.